Good evening, and welcome to day 2 of our Freedom Week. The reason for us being here tonight and the lecture that Professor Parks will give in a few minutes is the fact that this Sunday, September the 17th, is the 230th anniversary of the signing of the American Constitution. And this, as you may know, is the longest-lasting constitution in human history. This document, produced by the Founding Fathers' strong Christian convictions about right and wrong, is responsible for our people becoming the freest and most prosperous nation on earth. Today, however, the future of our freedoms and prosperity are threatened. Our constitutionally protected rights to freely worship God are curbed in the public arena. Free speech is censored on campuses across the country. Police are seizing property of citizens not convicted of any crimes. Unelected bureaucrats, unaccountable to the people, have usurped most legislative powers from Congress. So-called welfare programs have legalized plunder. Minimum wages are preventing voluntary exchanges and hurting the poor. Kangaroo courts are destroying reputations, careers, and lives. And how did we get here in this mess? We got here because we let the Constitution to die in our hearts and minds. Because our public schools are failing to teach our young people the fundamentals of the American idea. The Constitution, says Don Boudreau, our guest speaker at the opening of Freedom Week last night, is the dominant ideology within us. No words on parchment will ever override the prevailing belief system of the people who form a polity. Ideas, not words, are the principal ingredient of the American Constitution. If ideas change, so does the Constitution. And the only way really to change the Constitution is to change the ideas accepted by the great swath of citizens. So it's up to us, all of us, to stop expecting too much from our federal government and to take more responsibility for our own lives, as did the heroes of the American Revolution. Remember Thomas Paine? His warning, government, even at its best, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one. So we have two paths in front of us. One leads to more bureaucratic tyranny and decay. The other to liberty under the re-established rule of law. Liberty, notes Don Boudreau, cannot be secured by asking its foe, the state, for more respect. Liberty cannot be secured at ballot boxes or in courtrooms. Liberty must reside in the hearts of the people if it is to reign. And the only way that liberty can find its way into the hearts of the people is through the promulgation and circulation of the ideas of liberty. In these ideas lies liberty's only hope. This is the purpose of Freedom Week. Thank you for coming.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our second event of Northwood University's Freedom Week. First off, I'd like to start by thanking our sponsors, both IHS and the McNair Center, for funding our amazing week of speakers today. All right, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Parks. He has earned his Ph.D. in political science at Boston University after an undergraduate in math and political science at Dickinson University. He has spent his educational career at the Exeter, New Hampshire Classical Christian School as principal, teacher, and also as the headmaster before coming to King's College. He has written and spoken on founders Abraham Lincoln, the generation of American statesmen, and also the Republican government and the role of the natural law in civil legislation. For the last several years, his research has focused on the Federalist from 2013 to 2015. He co-authored with David Corbin, The Federalist Today, a series of essays connecting principles of the Federalist contemporary politics. And without further ado, I'd like you to join me in welcoming Matthew Parks to speak on good government from reflection and choice.
Thank you all very much. I think I'm on now. It's a pleasure to be here, to be part of Freedom Week, and to help you celebrate Constitution Day. In particular, being at Northwood is a nice break from New York City, where I teach and where I lived for 5 years. My family got too big after a while to afford living in the city, and so we moved about 25 miles north, a small town with a small house, but a little more green space. Certainly not like what you have here. It's a beautiful campus, and it's a joy to be here. I want to try to give you an overview of one of those key ideas that Dr. Tokarev was just talking about, which I really think encapsulates the heart of the Constitution, that heart, not just the ideas on the paper, but also the heart of the movement of the American founding as it worked itself out over several generations that followed. And that is the idea of self-government. Self-government, as we'll see, both as a public idea as well as a private orientation. Right? Two aspects of self-government. You got to stick with me here. Right? I know it's late in the evening, right? And you've probably had a long day of class. Third weekend, starting to wear down a little bit, right? I know, I just came from my own classes. So I'm going to do some de Tocqueville, some Federalist Papers, little George Washington, throw that at you too. It might be a little bit deep at points, but as Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. I'm trying to make a case for self-government, which means being a responsible person who can make wise decisions, who can reflect on important public questions and choose well. And so in order to make that point, I've got to give you the good stuff. We've got to take you to those source texts, which are challenging to reflect upon and challenging to think about in the context of a public lecture like this. So stick with me. I think there's a lot for us here this evening as we explore the idea of self-government. So I want to begin with a passage from Alexis de Tocqueville, which was written in 1840, but it might have been written today, or it might have been written projecting a future not far from today. This is what he says near the very end of Democracy in America. I want to imagine with what new features despotism could be produced in the world. Very cheerful topic, right? I see an innumerable crowd of like and equal men who revolve on themselves without repose, procuring the small and vulgar pleasures with which they fill their souls. Each of them, withdrawn and apart, is like a stranger to the destiny of all the others. His children and his particular friends form the whole human species for him. As for dwelling with his fellow citizens, he is beside them, but does not see them. He touches them, but does not feel them. He exists only in himself and for himself and his smartphone. No, that's not actually in the original. All right, folks, come on. You got to be with me here, right? All right, that's a joke. All right, I won't have to warn you about those. Right, there were no smartphones in 1840, right? Okay. What's the new iPhone going for? It's announced today, right? $1,000. What are they charging? Yeah. All right. Smartphones, right? Not in 1840. If a family still remains for him, one can at least say that he no longer has a native country. Above these, an immense tutelary power is elevated, which alone takes charge of assuring their enjoyments and watching over their fate. It is absolute, detailed, regular, far-seeing, and mild. It would resemble paternal power if, like that, it had for its object to prepare men for manhood. But on the contrary, it seeks only to keep them fixed irrevocably in childhood. It likes citizens to enjoy themselves, provided they think only of enjoying themselves. It willingly works for their happiness, but it wants to be the unique agent and sole arbiter of that happiness. provides for their security, foresees and secures their needs, facilitates their pleasures, conducts their principal affairs, directs their industry, regulates their estates, divides their inheritances? Can it not take away from them entirely the trouble of thinking and the pain of living? So it is that every day it renders the employment of free will less useful and more rare. It confines the action of the will in a smaller space, and little by little steals the very use of free will from each citizen. Democracy, Tocqueville argues, allows the common citizen to enjoy many pleasures unavailable to him in an aristocratic society. Democracy also frees us from the social obligations that link class to class, family to family, individual to individual in an aristocracy. In ordinary circumstances, we don't need each other. And because of how similar we are to each other, even if we did, we couldn't do very much for each other. With plenty of entertainments to fill our free time and no obligations to draw us out of the narrow circle of family and friends, the serious business of politics becomes a distraction, an unwelcome imposition upon our leisure. We can still spare a few minutes to condemn the latest Twitter-generated outrage and adopt today's socially appropriate pose on Facebook. But if there are others who will settle the public business, so much the better. We ask only this, that they use their power to preserve and extend equality, the equality that democratic societies cherish most. We shouldn't be surprised if the result is the complex network of petty regulations that Tocqueville predicted. Childlike behavior encourages paternalistic government. And we may actually welcome a bureaucratized life, which, though filled with little annoyances like the proverbial line at the DMV or the indignities of airline travel, I can tell you some stories from today, still promises a kind of stability that assures our envious hearts that no one is secretly getting ahead. This part of Tocqueville's analysis, his critique of a degraded democratic people, is easily overlooked because of the power of his description of the government over them, that second paragraph I read just a moment ago. As I said, I teach in New York City, so it's almost inevitable that when I read that passage, my students will bring up former Mayor Michael Bloomberg's proposal to limit diners to 16 ounces of soda in city restaurants. It turns out our super sophisticated Manhattanites aren't able to control themselves when you put a big gulp in front of them. Now, the good news is nothing came of it. You can still go to Coney Island, get your world-famous hot dog and 64 ounces of soda. Okay? But it was close, and it was admired by many. And there were a lot of folks in New York City that thought that was a proposal whose time has come. Now, you might laugh, well, of course, New York City, right? What do you expect? But you can't laugh too hard, because I read the other day in a report from the Mackinac Center that it takes more hours of education to become a barber in Michigan than it does to become a lawyer. Now, I'm not making a lawyer joke here. I'm sure the distinguished members of the Michigan Bar do very well with their 1,200 hours of instruction. But did you know it takes 1,800 hours to become a licensed barber? My wife actually cuts my hair and does a great job given what she's got to work with. But if my flight were a little later tomorrow morning, I might be tempted to see what one of your postdoc barbers could do. Obviously, it's working for Kid Rock. Now, 1,800 hours might seem like a lot, but it actually used to be 2,000 hours until just a couple of years ago. That reduction came in 2012 when a state representative proposed getting rid of licensing altogether. Who knows what might have happened if the director of one of Michigan's 5 barber schools hadn't sounded the alarm. It does have a lot to do with public health, he said. I'm not saying we're as important as doctors, but we are the closest you can get. We're turning this into the wild, wild west. I'd like to see them get a haircut in a barber shop 5 years from now. It'll be like rolling the dice. That's at least one dystopian future we've been able to avoid. Now, these examples are amusing, but it would be easier to laugh at the excesses of our hyper-regulative state if Tocqueville's description of democratic despotism didn't seem increasingly apt. Our contentment with material satisfaction and our fear of anything that would threaten it makes us willing and even eager to embrace rules calculated to protect us from the many dangers of a complex world and relieve us of the burden of managing our complicated lives. Meanwhile, our ruling class has been educated for a century in a progressive ideology fundamentally committed to expert management of social problems and promising great success from the effort. The result? A generation raised by helicopter parents may be glad to find helicopter pseudo-parents ready to take over when or if they finally leave home. And the pseudo-parents are ready. Don't be those children. Now, just as we're giving up some part of our self-government then, others are coming to take more. It's not hard to imagine the implications for our ability to make the crucial decisions that shape the course of our lives. But Tocqueville also shows that democracy itself is dangerously threatened by the ruling class's infantilization of the people. He writes, "If one must conduct small affairs in which simple good sense can suffice, the ruling class determines that citizens are incapable of it. If it is a question of the government of the whole state, they entrust immense prerogatives in these citizens. They make them alternately the playthings of the sovereign and its masters, more than kings and less than men. It is in fact difficult to conceive how men who have entirely renounced the habit of directing themselves could succeed at choosing well those who will lead them. And one will not make anyone believe that a liberal, energetic, and wise government can ever issue from the suffrage of a people of servants." Can the tension between these two pictures of human beings be resolved? Are we so degraded that we require perpetual parental supervision and yet are somehow capable of choosing our political parents well? Those incapable of choosing the proper soda size seem like a poor choice for the electors of a good government. As Tocqueville notes, there are only two ways out of this dilemma. One possibility is for the people to reassert their dignity and regain authority over their private lives. This requires more than a petulant act of will. It requires accepting moral responsibility for the actions that follow, an adult's rather than a child's response. The other, less happy resolution means giving up the power that remains in our political lives. We can still keep our elections while accepting that more and more decisions are made by those only distantly accountable to the public. This then is the irony of popular self-government as we find it at the end of democracy in America. The very regime that seems best to embody the noble dignity of the individual as a responsible actor in our private and public affairs tends to degrade our capacity for self-government by distracting us with material pleasures and calling forth a centralized, bureaucratic state to regulate them. I will take it for granted that this is a problem to be solved. That if we find ourselves in circumstances even faintly similar to those Tocqueville describes, we would wish to find a way forward more in keeping with our nature. I will also take it for granted that we would wish to reform our popular government rather than replace it, that we doubt the solution to democratic despotism is a despotism of another type, however benevolent in theory it might be. In such cases, we would do well to return to the most profound exposition of the case for self-government ever penned on American soil, that of the Federalist Papers, from which I've drawn the title of this address, Good Government from Reflection and Choice. The Federalist, as you probably know, was co-authored by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay to persuade the people of New York and beyond to support the ratification of the Constitution. Though the 85 essays that comprise the work were written at a frenetic pace, they nevertheless encapsulate the founding generation's best understanding of the case for Republican government and the role of the people and their leaders as a part of it. The Federalist ultimately shows us a way out of Tocqueville's dilemma, a form of self-government ennobling for both the governors and the governed. We get our first glimpse of this solution in the pen name that Hamilton, Madison, and Jay used in writing their essays, Publius. The ratification debate on both sides was, among other things, a battle of pen names. Two of Publius's most formidable opponents were Brutus and Cato. If you know a little about Roman history, you probably know more about them than you do about Publius, who was one of the original founders of the Roman Republic. Most importantly, he was given the name Publicula, friend of the people, by the Roman people themselves because of his selfless sacrifice in the cause of the Republic, including, as Plutarch tells the story, his willingness to tear down his own splendid house on a hill above the Forum to refute popular suspicion that he wished to be king. Literally tore the house down to the ground in order to satisfy the people. The American Publius, though also suspected of having aristocratic or monarchic pretensions, chose another way to demonstrate his public spiritedness. Now, as we all know, there's more than one way to win a political debate. One may appeal to common opinion, stand upon one's reputation or authority, intimidate with threats of violence, hypnotize with fair-sounding rhetoric, or make an attempt at rational persuasion, make an argument and hope people will respond. It is Publius's pride that, in the largest sense, he made use only of rational persuasion, even though it put the success of his project at risk. Though he wanted to win the argument for ratification, he was willing to risk losing it so the victory would be a true one. Self-government could only be vindicated by embracing both its dignity and its dangers. Tricking the people into choosing well would make no case in favor of self-government. The first paragraph of the first Federalist essay sets this up for us. After an unequivocal experience, Hamilton writes, of the inefficacy of the subsisting federal government, there's a mouthful for you, you are called upon to deliberate on a new constitution for the United States of America. The subject speaks its own importance, comprehending in its consequences nothing less than the existence of the Union, the safety and welfare of the parts of which it is composed, the fate of an empire in many respects the most interesting in the world. Now listen carefully. It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or where they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. Reflection and choice, or accident and force. The debate over the Constitution, Publius begins, will determine whether the Union will survive and how far the safety and welfare of the individual states will be preserved. But it will also decide whether there is any real possibility of transcending the common experience of history, that governments must trace their beginnings to accident and force rather than reflection and choice. It is, of course, possible for accident and force to produce good government. But there is no reason intrinsic to accident and force to expect this. Justice does not often appear by chance in our fallen world, nor is it the usual companion of overwhelming power. On the other hand, there's a rational connection between reflection and choice, wisdom and sound judgment, on the one hand, and good government on the other. Achieving justice requires both knowing what it is and willing that it be accomplished. So much for the theory. But was it really possible for a large and diverse nation of 4 million people to conduct a reasonable public debate on a new frame of government, elect wise representatives to conventions called to ratify it, and then peacefully accept and implement the results? Excuse me. Publius himself was anything but utopian. Repeatedly in the Federalist, he warns and worries, in the language of Federalist 1, that a torrent of angry and malignant passions will be let loose, just as in all former cases of great national discussion. Yet he determines to address the understanding of the people rather than inflame their passions, while attempting the most difficult act of self-government, establishing a good popular government in the first place. Now, no one would expect a well-framed, popular government to spring up spontaneously from the people. But as Federalist 38 points out, neither did the United States adopt the ancient model of founding by placing its hopes in the hands of a single wise lawgiver. Rather, through a convention of delegates appointed by the states, representatives of the people themselves met and deliberated on a new constitution for the United States. If you've read any of the records of the Constitutional Convention, you know this was a messy process. Important questions were considered, reconsidered, and reconsidered over the course of the summer of 1787, as further reflection brought new light and new discussions recast the consequences of old ones. And yet, while the convention, which as Dr. Tokarev noted, completed its work 230 years ago this Sunday, was itself Republican in an unprecedented way, there was still room in the progress of ratification for a wise, publicly spirited friend to play something of the part of the lawgivers of old. Rather than framing the Constitution, it would fall to Publius to show the reason of the Constitution and to aid the people in performing their part, to choose freely and rationally a government framed by the reflections of their representatives. As we've already noted along the way, the American Publius, like his Roman namesake, would be suspected of having insufficient sympathy for the people. However, rather than tearing his own house down to remove their envious feelings, he invites them up to build with him an extended republic for the protection of private rights and public happiness, to build their dream house with blueprints he and others will supply. Will they accept the invitation? The two most famous founders that Publius cites in Federalist 38 are Solon and Lycurgus, the great lawgivers of ancient Athens and Sparta. Publius contrasts them in two ways. First, he argues that Solon framed new laws for Athens in a manner strictly regular, that is, having been appointed to the task by the people themselves. On the other hand, the proceedings under Lycurgus were less regular. Lycurgus imposed himself, in a certain sense, upon Sparta. But second, and more important, Publius contrasts the more temporizing policy of Solon, who confessed that he had not given to his countrymen the government best suited to their happiness, but that which was most tolerable to their prejudices. On the other hand, Lycurgus, more true to his object, was under the necessity of mixing a portion of violence with the authority of superstition, and of securing his final success by a voluntary renunciation, first of his country and then of his life. According to Plutarch, Lycurgus made the people of Sparta swear they would keep his laws unchanged until he returned to the city from a visit to the oracle at Delphi, and then intentionally starved himself to death to make the laws permanent. They say for 500 years, even longer than our own Constitution. To secure good government, as Lycurgus understood it, required a portion of violence and an appeal to the authority of superstition, the oracle. In other words, force and a sort of accident. How about Solon? According to Plutarch, what he thought he could effect by persuasion upon the pliable and force upon the stubborn, that he did. As he himself says, with force and justice working both together. Neither Lycurgus nor Solon, then, was willing to find out if it was possible to establish good government entirely from reflection and choice. Now, the challenge is that the examples suggest that if you want to persuade people, you have to give them what they want rather than that which is good. And so perhaps all the American experiment proves is that you can choose a mediocre government rather than a good one. Now, Publius does not believe, does not argue, as no one would perhaps, that the Constitution is flawless. Rather, he acknowledges in Federalist 85, as he has in earlier essays, that the convention made important compromises in framing the Constitution. Nevertheless, he concludes, I am persuaded it is the best which our political situation, habits, and opinions will admit, and superior to any the Revolution has produced. Later on, in the last Federalist essay, Publius expands on this observation. No advocate, he says, of the measure, that is, the Constitution, can be found who will not declare as his sentiment that the system, though it may not be perfect in every part, is upon the whole a good one, is the best the present views and circumstances of the country will permit, and is such a one as promises every species of security which a reasonable people can desire. Though the convention has accommodated itself to the American people, it is still a good government, not merely a mediocre one. It was framed by a deliberative process, defended in the Federalist anyway, by arguments alone, allowing Publius to claim at the end, thus have I, my fellow citizens, executed the task I had assigned to myself. With what success your conduct must determine. The people, in some sense, would decide whether Publius was successful, not just in making the case for ratification, but in making the case for the possibility of good government from reflection and choice. If a people is incapable of choosing a form of government wisely, and if appeals to the judgments of the people are easily overwhelmed by those who flatter them, then on what basis could Publius recommend republican government to the esteem and adoption of mankind, as he puts it in Federalist 10? On what basis could Publius conclude that he had shown that it was the people's honorable determination to rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government, or again, to show that it's possible to frame good government from reflection and choice? So it is with great solemnity that Publius then turns and speaks to his audience. Now hear these words from him as words to you as citizens of a republic today. Let us now pause and ask ourselves whether in the course of these papers the proposed Constitution has not been satisfactorily vindicated from the aspersions thrown upon it, and whether it has not been shown to be worthy of the public approbation, and whether it has not been shown, and necessary to the public safety and prosperity. Listen carefully. Every man is bound to answer these questions to himself, according to the best of his conscience and understanding, and to act agreeably to the genuine and sober dictates of his judgment. This is a duty from which nothing can give him a dispensation. 'Tis one that he is called upon, nay, constrained by all the obligations that form the bands of society, to discharge sincerely and honestly. No partial motive, no particular interest, no pride of opinion, no temporary passion or prejudice will justify to himself, to his country, or to his posterity an improper election of the part he is to act. Publius is warned that human beings act on their short-term interest, will not be dissuaded by religious motives from seizing an opportunity for unjust gain, and generally have the least spirit of moderation on those occasions which require an unusual degree of it. But if wise statesmen will account for those weaknesses, they may not excuse them. The Declaration of Independence does not begin with natural rights, but rather with human responsibility. The duty to give reasons that justify one's actions before the opinions of mankind under the laws of nature and of nature's God. Giving such reasons, in fact, is the central purpose of the Declaration. The Second Continental Congress asserted the independence of the United States in a resolution approved July 2nd, 1776. The war that by then was 15 months old would determine whether that independence would last. All that remained on July 4th was giving reasons for independence. But that was the most important work of all. Those reasons began with the principle of human equality, an equality rationally grounded in the inherent dignity of all human beings, not some leveling passion. Because human beings are equal, there can be no legitimate government power without the consent of the governed. This, of course, is the original claim to self-government. But also because human beings are equal, there are moral boundaries to that consent. A self-governing people is not thereby a law to itself. Thus, Publius charges his reader to judge and act only according to the genuine and sober dictates of his judgment. Self-government does not legitimize partiality, self-dealing, or legislating prejudice. It is the reason alone of the public that ought to control and regulate the government, as Publius writes in Federalist 49. America's Publius, like the Roman before him, is ultimately a friend of the people. Over 85 essays, he reasons through the Constitution, attempting to persuade, but only to persuade the people of the wisdom of ratifying it. In doing so, he pays them the highest honor of the magnanimous statesmen, a respect for their dignity as responsible moral agents and their judgment as responsible citizens. Publius also shows us a way out of Tocqueville's dilemma. He first models the leader as wise counselor, like a father speaking to adult children. He neither desires to be, nor does he presume that they need him to be, a rule-making busybody. Those who imitate Publius will present their arguments in ways that might be persuasive to more than just the members of their party. This means foregoing combat with flimsy straw men and meeting opponents at their strongest point, as Publius did many times over the course of the Federalist. The introduction to Abraham Lincoln's 1854 speech at Peoria, Illinois, provides an amusing but instructive illustration of this kind of leadership. After 5 years on the sidelines, Lincoln had been drawn back into politics by the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed the people of the Kansas and Nebraska territories to decide if they wanted slavery or not, thereby setting aside the prohibition on slavery in those territories that had been in place since the Missouri Compromise had been approved in 1820. Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas was the principal architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and a man with whom Lincoln had engaged in political debates for almost 2 decades by the time they met at Peoria. According to the newspaper report of the speech, after Senator Douglas finished speaking, quote, Mr. Lincoln then took the stand and said, I do not rise to speak now if I can stipulate with the audience to meet me here at 6:30 or at 7 o'clock. It is now several minutes past 5, and Judge Douglas has spoken over 3 hours. If you hear me at all, I wish you to hear me through. It will take me as long as it has taken him. That will carry us beyond 8 o'clock at night. Now, every one of you who can remain that long can just as well get his supper, meet me at 7, and remain 1 or 2 hours later. The judge has already informed you that he is to have an hour to reply to me. I doubt not, but you have been a little surprised to learn that I have consented to give one of his high reputation and known ability this advantage of me. Indeed, my consenting to it, though reluctant, was not wholly unselfish. Listen to this. For I suspected, if it were understood that the judge was entirely done, you Democrats would leave and not hear me. But by giving him the close, I felt confident you would stay for the fun of hearing him skin me. Lincoln wanted to be heard by everyone in the audience, including all the Douglas Democrats, even if that meant giving the powerful senator the chance to skin him. As it turns out, the audience also wanted to hear him. The newspaper report continues. The audience signified their assent to the arrangement and adjourned to 7:00 p.m., at which time they reassembled and Mr. Lincoln spoke substantially as follows, a speech that takes up 40 pages in the standard edition of Lincoln's works. By the way, have you all had your dinner? Okay, good. We can go on for 2 more hours then, right? Okay. No, I won't do that. I can't do that. I'm not Lincoln or Douglas. Now, the other part of Publius's solution is a people engaged in responsible decision-making, like that crowd there in Peoria. As it turns out, no generation of Americans since the days of the founding has had before it the monumental choice to adopt or reject a general frame of government for our nation. Publius's principles nevertheless speak to our circumstances as well. We should not cast the votes we do have merely to support our partial motives, particular interests, ill-considered opinions, and temporary passions or prejudices. Enlightened self-interest and the long history of our past elections remind us that those who are in the majority today may be the minority very soon. Experience teaches us the boundaries of government power, once expanded, rarely contract, and that leaders will exercise the full limits of their power. We would be wise, then, to do to others only that which we would have done to ourselves. But more than that, our inescapable moral knowledge teaches us that it's wrong to violate the dignity of our neighbor or to pretend that we can transfer our moral responsibility to the experts. George Washington, in his first inaugural address, drew these points together in a charge to both the Congress and the American people. Speaking first to the Congress, he praised it for the talents, the rectitude, and the patriotism characteristic of its members. I wonder if he'd have the same words for today's Congress. In these honorable qualifications, he said, I behold the surest pledges that as on one side no local prejudices or attachments, no separate views nor party animosities will misdirect the comprehensive and equal eye which ought to watch over this great assemblage of communities and interests. So on another, the foundation of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality, and the preeminence of free government be exemplified by all the attributes which can win the affections of its citizens and command the respect of the world. Members of Congress, Washington argued, came from different places, but should make laws that would be good for everyone, not just their local constituents, following the general principles of morality that should guide the conduct of all people. A government committed to such principles and embodying them in its laws would both win the affections of its citizens and command the respect of the world. As Washington extends the point, though, the audience expands to include the whole nation. I dwell on this prospect, he says, with every satisfaction which an ardent love for my country can inspire, since there is no truth more thoroughly established than that there exists in the economy and course of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness, between duty and advantage, between the genuine maxims of an honest and magnanimous policy and the solid rewards of public prosperity and felicity. Since we ought not to be less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. And since the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps as finally, staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty depends on America's adherence to the pure and immutable principles of private morality. The survival of public self-government depends upon our commitment to personal self-government. Thus, our most important choices may not be our votes to elect the president and members of Congress. No doubt Tocqueville's democratic despotism starts with the concentration of power in a single national government. Nevertheless, the reinvigoration of self-government in our day may begin with the exercise of responsible decision-making in our private lives and our local affairs. A few years ago, there was a poster in New York City subway stations depicting a male stick figure slumped against a pole near the edge of the platform, apparently in danger of sliding off the platform onto the tracks below. The caption read something like this: "If you see someone in trouble, tell the police or a subway employee." Now, I'm sure the good folks who came up with that poster had the best of intentions, but maybe the best thing to do if you see a man about to fall on the subway tracks is to catch him so he doesn't fall on the subway tracks, rather than go looking for a police officer or a subway employee. Now, that's literally true in the scenario depicted on the poster, but it's metaphorically true in many more common situations we face each day. We can be grateful for the experts of various sorts who diagnose our diseases, program our computers, fix our cars, protect our streets, fight our wars, even make our laws, while still respecting and asserting our control in the normal circumstances of everyday life, and demonstrating in our generation, once again, the capacity of mankind for self-government. Though democracy has in a certain sense overtaken the world, it may still be true that ensuring the survival of Republican government is a peculiarly American responsibility, not as a matter of historical heritage or ethnic identity, but as a consequence of self-evident truths asserted and thereby promises made nearly 2.5 centuries ago. Thus, we do well to honor the Constitution's frame of self-government and Publius's case for self-government, and to labor wisely and rightly for a more perfect expression of good government from reflection and choice. Thank you. All right, now I understand there's to be questions if you have them, and that I'm not to give you a break, so you can't escape before the questions begin. We have a microphone. Okay, excellent.
Professor Parks, I want to thank you for your lecture. And although it's Constitution Day and we need to celebrate the Constitution, I want to push back. Professor Talker began by saying that the enemy of freedom is the state, and as he also said, the Constitution has been lost. But I wonder if we give the Constitution too much credit. So let me make my case and elicit your response. When Patrick Henry is invited, essentially, to the Constitutional Convention, he says, "I smell a rat." And he refuses to hold any federal office under the Constitution, although he's dear friends, of course, with George Washington. George Mason walks out of the convention, as you know. The deliberations are done in secret. I think, forget that. The ratification is precarious. There is no Bill of Rights. Why not celebrate the anti-federalists? Why not celebrate those who wanted more local government, less centralization? Think of Hamilton's endorsement of energetic government, which doesn't seem like a very libertarian thing, right? And then you mention Lincoln, who, in the service of preserving the Union, winds up prosecuting a war that results in the death of hundreds of thousands of Americans. So I want to elicit your reaction to the idea that maybe the Constitution is part of the problem rather than the solution, whether decentralization would have been a more correct solution to our problems.
Yeah.
Think of the Articles of Confederation. And whether you think the Constitution is perpetual, whether the Union is perpetual, if you side with Lincoln on that, or whether you would support secession, whether then or now.
Okay. Well, there's the 2 hours, okay? So sit tight. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there, obviously, and we've got big debates that you're opening up, which I would love to engage as much as I can. I would say this. I think that the problem with the Constitution is not the Constitution today. It's progressivism. It's an abandonment of the Constitution that was conceived 130 or so years ago. You think of the work of Woodrow Wilson as an academic and then as president, and on it goes. It was a reimagining the role of government, sometimes dressed in the language of the Constitution, but largely abandoning it. I don't think there's anything inherent in the Constitution that leads us in that direction. No necessary trajectory from the founders' Constitution to the progressivism and the state we have today. I think compared to the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution is a wise document, well framed. The Articles, I think, would have been a failure if they weren't already a failure at the point of the convention. The kind of government we're talking about, I mean, take Hamilton at its most extreme, right? It's a minuscule government compared to anything you have beginning with Wilson, New Deal, and beyond, right? Big government, Hamilton, is tiny government. There are more people, including slaves, working on Washington's plantation than there were working in his administration. Hamilton was the Department of Treasury with a couple of clerks, right? So the scale of government we're talking about in the founding era and for generations to follow that is so small that I think our orientation of kind of the big government, little government, Hamilton, Jefferson kind of debate misses the fact that it's all small government. The Federalist presupposes that all the normal police powers and things will be local if there's government role there at all. It seems absurd to them that you would micromanage the affairs of individuals from Washington or anywhere else. So I would defend them insofar as I would suggest that the Constitution's vision is not what we see today, that there was a revolution, a deliberate revolution, to reframe and to refound, in essence, our government in the progressive era that's been successful by and large. And that a recapturing of the argument made by Publius in the Federalist Papers in defense of the Constitution would lead us very much in the direction that I think everybody here is interested in going. Does it end up with a libertarian Constitution? Maybe not. I'm not a libertarian. I'm a conservative. So there may be some points, right? But we have a long way to go before we start running into the divergences of those two paths. We can all agree there's a lot of work to be done before we get into the details of just how small that national government needs to be compared to where it is today. On the question of secession, there's a big can of worms there, but I think Lincoln is on point. I think he's right philosophically, legally. I think his first inaugural address is unanswerable in terms of the argument against secession. There are better ways to resist unjust government, revolution among them, as Lincoln himself points out. But secession, I don't think is philosophically coherent, nor do I think it's legally or historically proper. That ought to stir things up a little bit, right? All right, what do we got?
Is it working? Okay. Thank you, Dr. Parks, by the way, for that lecture. I know you talked a lot about Publius and the role of the Republic within the Roman Empire, or before, pre-Roman Empire. What about, what in our Constitution does it say anything about spreading democracy throughout other countries?
Yeah, that's really not a part of the original vision. I mean, I think Washington's farewell address captures very nicely the goal of American foreign policy. The goal is to be able to do justice and to have the power and capacity to do that, not to make other nations better, not to reform the world. There's many passages you can find in Monroe, John Quincy Adams. I mean, there's a long tradition of American foreign policy, really well up almost to the 20th century. But he essentially says, no, look, if self-government is the rare and precious thing that I was just saying that it was, using the passages I was quoting, then you have to guard that and protect that, right? Your gift to the world is proving that self-government is possible, that proving Republican government is possible. And if you give that up, even with the best of intentions, you will have sacrificed the most valuable thing you can give. You want to think charitably of the world? Then demonstrate the possibility of free government. Demonstrate the possibility of self-government. And the world can follow the example, right, as you light the path.
Unless anyone else has a final question, just one more.
Thanks.
All right, I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight. It was an amazing speaker. I'd also like to invite you to our speech on Thursday night with Bill Whittle. And one last time as we head out, thank Professor Parks once again.